Hey guys, it's Dr. J here. Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I'm going to demonstrate the use of buttons to navigate through various sections of your web page. Imagine having a web page with loads of information. With the help of these buttons, you can swiftly move to specific parts you require by simply clicking on the button. Let's look at how to create this web page. I'm currently in CodePen, and I've created a project called Menu Options, and I'm going to write the HTML code where we can create this web page with different buttons, and it will have a whole lot of information that we can move to on the web page. So let's start with the creation of 3 buttons. In my HTML, I'll just make this a little bigger and make that a bit wider. There we are. I've got 3 buttons. The first button has ID about, and this is has the name about, as you can see at the bottom. The second button is called Tools, and the third button is called Integration. And each of these buttons have their unique IDs. So the buttons are set up. Next, I'm creating an H1 heading. The H1 heading simply says, "Welcome to my app." That's now set up. I've got a heading. Now I'm going to create my 3 subheadings. So my first subheading links to the first button, but I need some information regarding the About section of this web page. So as part of adding some information, I've got a paragraph tag. So here is the open paragraph tag, and at the bottom is the closing paragraph tag. And I've just copied and pasted some information into my page. So I'm not going to waste too much time in that regard. And you can see this page is now starting to take shape. Let's continue. I'm now going to create my second H3 heading, which is called Tools, and Tools will link to the second button that I have. I'm going to do something similar in the sense that I'm now going to add a paragraph that's related to Tools. So here's my open tag and my closing paragraph tag, and I've got some information regarding the tools for this web page that I'm creating. I'm going to go through this process one more time, but this time my heading is called Integration. Here it's an H3 tag as well. Open H3 and close H3 tag. And then we have the, apologies, let me just take this character out from here. And then we have our paragraph that's related to that particular heading. So what we've effectively written in our code is what I will do is just change my layout. I think this makes it a lot easier. I've got my 3 buttons: About, Tools, and Integration. And I've got these sections on my page. These are the 3 sections on my page. And the idea here is that when I click on these different buttons, it will take me to these different sections, especially if you have a situation where you've got a lot of information. You can see I'm making the web page a little smaller so that it makes it appear as if I have lots of information, but work on the assumption that we have lots of information on this web page. So when I click at the moment, I can't see what's under integration, but when I click on this button, it will take me, it'll scroll down to that section of the page. So what I will now get into is we'll just shape some of the buttons, we'll add a bit of CSS, and then we'll write the JavaScript for this. So I'm now wanting to transform these buttons. And in order to do that, I need to work with the CSS section. And here I'm transforming the button. So I'm creating a button. That's the button tag that I'm using. I've got an open and a closing curly bracket. The first is I'm just setting a margin. So there is some spacing between the buttons. And then second, I'm adding a little bit of padding. Now you can see that the buttons are taking on a better shape. The buttons look fuller. And I'm now adding a background color. So by changing the background color to something very close to black, it means I can't see what's written in the button. So to compensate for that, I can change the text color to white. And that then makes the button stand out. Then I can add a border around, I can shape the border around the buttons. In fact, I've taken out the border. And then I'm adding a radius, so you can see that the buttons are slightly rounded. You can play around with the figure, with the numbers, and you can see how they change. I'm just increasing the font size, right? I've just increased the font size for the button. And finally, I'm setting a cursor pointer. And what this means is that when I place my cursor on these buttons, you will see how it changes into a pointer. That's when they are placed. So this is now some of the CSS that I've added. With the padding, you can see that there were 2 parameters. So it added padding not only around the width, but also on the height. These are values that you can experiment with and see how they work. The next step is to add some functionality to these buttons so that when I click the buttons, there is some activity that takes place in terms of what we want to achieve. And I'm now going to go to the JavaScript section. And you will recall from the previous videos, one of the first things that we always do is link. We create a link between the buttons and between the HTML and the JavaScript. So in this instance, I've got 3 buttons. The ID is about, tools and integration, and I'm now creating links. So that's my 1, that's my 2nd, and then integration is my 3rd. So these are the links, and those links are stored in these variables. So when I refer to BTN about, I'm actually referring to the button that has an ID about. So I'm referring to this specific button. Now that I've created the link, I now want to write my listener. I want to add a listener for the about. And I want to add a click event. And when I click the about, it needs to scroll. The page should scroll to the about section. And The only way it can do this is to try to recognize some of the tags we have here. And remember that we've got these H3 tags for each of these. So we need to find some way in which it can know that this is the first H3 tag, this is the second, and that's the last tag. So in terms of coding, this is what we would now need. So if I look at the code here, you will see this is linked to BTN About. That's for the About button. I've got a listener, and the listener is waiting for a click to take place. And this is the function that will execute when there is a click on the About button. Inside of this function, I'm creating another constant variable. And this variable is linking, document.querySelector is linking, there's my H3 tab, and it's linking to the first H3 tag. And remember, we've got a paragraph tag as well. So it's looking for the first of these tags. And then using that variable that's linked to the first tags, we want to use that variable with the attribute scroll into view, and we want this to be a smooth transition as it moves to that part or that section in the web page. So that's what's going on here. And if I then click on the About, you will notice it moves to that section. So it does what we want it to achieve. So for the second button, BTN Tools, we're going to achieve something very similar. The difference is, how do we recognize the second H3 tag and paragraph? In this instance, we now will use code similar to the previous button, except now we are coding BTN Tools. That translates to the Tools button. We have a listener, a click, a function, very similar to the way the previous button was coded. And the only difference is the position it needs to go to in terms of where it needs to scroll. And here you will notice it needs to go to the second H3 tag, and it needs to find the paragraph thereafter. So once this code is in place, I can now click on Tools, and you will see that this is now visible. That section is now visible on the screen. Similarly, if I click on About, then that section was visible. Finally, the last button requires us to code integration, very similar to the other two, and the only difference being that we want to go to the last H3 tag and the paragraph that's after that tag. And once that code is in place, when I now click on this button, it brings up that particular section. This pretty much completes the coding. When I click on About, I can go back up, click on Tools, and I can click on Integration. I could perhaps make this a little smaller, and you can then see how it brings up the different sections of our web page. So we have these buttons in place that take us through the different sections on the web page. Let's try to enhance this application, and let's have a button at the bottom which takes me back to the top of my web page when the button is clicked. So to do something like that, let me go to my HTML section. I want to go to the end of my HTML section, and I want to add a button. So there we are, button. This ID is called back to top, and I've put in the label back to top. So if I scroll to the bottom, you can see that we now have a button that says back to top. Now we need to code this button, so when it is clicked, it takes me to the top of the page. I need to go to my HTML section. I need to go to the JavaScript section. And here, the first thing I would need to do is create a variable that links to that button. And to do that, we would then create my variable, which I've called btn back to top, and that links to the unique ID back to top, which was in the HTML section. Now the code for the back to top button, I will need to come to the end, and this is the code I need. So when the back to top button is pressed, I've got a listener checking to see when it is pressed. And when it is pressed, I just simply go to the top where it is set to 0. With that margin set to 0, or that position of the top set to 0, it will bring me back to my original position. So let's give this a try. If I click on integration, it'll take me to the bottom. And once I click back to top, that brings me back to the top of my page. So that works quite nicely. If I click on About, it brings me to the About section. I will need to scroll to the bottom and then get back to the top. Maybe as a last feature, what we could do is let's put in a label after the About, and when I click on the label, it'll do pretty much the same and take me to the top. I need to add a label, and that label should appear at the end of the About section. So let me go to the HTML section. And in the HTML section, I will identify the About. And here's my paragraph. So this is somewhere where I need to insert the label. So this is the label where I'm calling it top 1, the opening for the label, and here is the closing. So it's just a simple label, nothing else. And here it creates the label for me. Now I need to distinguish the label from the text. So I think I'm going to add some CSS for that particular label. And I'm going to set the properties, firstly the color, I'll set it to blue. And I'm going to set the cursor to a pointer. So when I put my cursor on it, that indicates that it's just not normal text and something's going to happen, like the button. We had a cursor, the pointer cursor for the buttons. So we have a similar situation here. So that's the CSS. Now I need to go to the JavaScript. The first step would be to create a link to the HTML. So that you will notice that I've created a constant variable. I should be consistent, and all of my variables should have been constant variables. So I've got a variable called LBL top1, and that's linked. That's the link to my variable. So take note of how that is written. It's label 4 equals top1. And finally, I need to write the code. And the code is going to be similar to what we wrote earlier on. In this case, it is my label. The label is going to be listening for a click. And when the click takes place, it's going to do exactly what the back to top button achieved. So if we try this out, if I click on About first, and then I click on Top, it takes me to the top of the application. And then the other buttons will still work the way we had coded them. So this is a little application that shows you how to navigate through different sections of your web page. I hope this helps you when you're coding your projects. Till the next video, take care. Bye.